It's a spectrum, right?
Right.
So your metabolism is a spectrum, and the output would be your respiratory quotient, which is, your O2 consumption, CO2 production. It comes out as an equation in expired air. So as we reduce carbohydrates and when we reduce sugar and we add more fat in, we start to oxidize more fat. We're omnivores. We are great in that we burn what we feed our bodies. And if we can adapt our metabolism over time to be more metabolically flexible, which means, and we should do this, we should vary our macronutrient, ratios and things like that. But if we simply titrate the carbohydrates down, typical U.S. carbohydrate consumption anywhere from 200-300, maybe athletes 400 grams of carbs a day. If we back that down to maybe start 200, then go 100, and then drop it, then we're shifting our metabolism to burn more fat and less glucose, right? And when in regards to low carb and ketogenic diets, the more you do it, the easier it gets and the more benefits you derive from it because you're getting more adaptive effects from it. So a scenario would be that if you go on a ketogenic diet and follow it for a couple of months, or we did this with rats where we put them on a ketogenic diet and then we take them off the ketogenic diet and put them back on the ketogenic diet again, they make ketones much faster once we switch back to a ketogenic diet. So we call that a metabolic switch.
You can hop in and out quickly.
Yeah, so this metabolic switch. We noticed though that older rats don't have that robust metabolic switch as much, but if we do intermittent fasting is a way to increase that. So there are different approaches you could take to get your body. I think your listeners really want to be more fat adapted, like coax their body into burning more fat, either dietary fat or fat on their body, obviously. So one way to do that would be to simply restrict the carbohydrates. It does not need to be ketogenic. You don't have to be in a state of super low glucose, low insulin to be making ketones. So that has benefits and can be therapeutic for many different things, right? But it doesn't, you could be burning your body fat at a much higher rate just by reducing carbohydrates and it's relatively speaking, right? So if you're eating 200 grams of carbs and you just drop it down to 50 to 100 grams of carbs, you're going to be burning twice as much fat. Literally. So your body is going to tap into its fat reserves and your dietary fat will be higher too if you shift. If you drop carbs, you got to replace it with something. You could do it with protein and fat. So the more we do that, there's adaptive processes that happen in our liver at the level of the muscle and even our brain. We start transporting ketones across the blood-brain barrier and then our brain starts using ketones for fuel. And not only using ketones for fuel, but the brain adapts to using lower levels of glucose, which means, and you see this with people with diabetes, right? So if someone's diabetic and they wear a continuous glucose monitor and their glucose level is stays at 150, and then through a dietary intervention or even a drug intervention, you drop that down to 90, that's still relatively high glucose. That should be a lot, but the relative changes that they will perceive that as hypoglycemia because their brain is used to 150 milligrams per deciliter of glucose, right? But when you go on a ketogenic diet or you do intermittent fasting, that trains your brain, for lack of a better term. I could talk mechanistically what's going on, but the brain adapts to being comfortable at a lower level of glucose. So I've been in situations where I'm fasting or on a ketogenic diet, or even if I take exogenous ketones, that tends to lower my glucose too, where my glucose is 52, sometimes as low as 48. And that's when I feel most lucid and have the most brain energy.
Right.
Because there's various transporters associated with getting glucose across membranes, and that could be the blood-brain barrier. And then you have the cellular membrane, which is the membrane on the neuron, getting it across there. And there's a variety of different transporters. With ketones, it's called the monocarboxylic acid transporter. And these things get upregulated, which means you have a neuron and it's got 100 little transporters, but you go on a ketogenic diet or start fasting, and then it ramps up production of these proteins, which are, your transporters are protein. They get embedded in the membranes, and then it allows your body to transport more of this energy across the membrane and then even into the mitochondria, where there's also transporters. So this adaptive process does not happen overnight, but the more you adhere to intermittent fasting protocols, carbohydrate restriction, or ketogenic diet, then you upregulate ketogenesis enzymes, which are enzymes that make ketones. So you're making more of this alternative fuel. You are augmenting the production of ketolytic enzymes, which are enzymes within the mitochondria in the cell that actually allow us to generate energy from ketones. And then you're also increasing the production of the transporters. So we can get more of this fuel across. So there's a lot of adaptive things. And you talked about, when you're fasting, you did more chin-ups and everything. I think a lot of things are going on there in that you basically, you're relieving your body of the burden of digestion, right? Digesting,
right. Yeah, of course.
And your organs there, that actually uses a lot of energy. So when you're fasting, all that extra energy and blood can actually go to your muscles and go to your brain. And when we fast, about 24 to 36 hours into fasting, we have about a 30% increase in brain blood flow. And this is kind of like a mystery, but people are studying this. And I think it has to be attributed to then your gastrointestinal system, your liver, your kidneys, your organs take up a massive amount of energy and blood. And then because you're not digesting food or anything, that frees up a lot of it. Your liver actually shrinks, you have less glycogen and less metabolic activity in the liver. So you have more blood in circulation available to your muscles. And the inflammatory state of your body goes down. So your inflammatory markers, your cytokines and your chemokines go down. And when that happens, the skeletal muscle, the actual contractile apparatus of the skeletal muscle, the calcium signaling, even at the level of the sarcoplasmic, reticulum and the neuromuscular junction, you have a better activation of muscle contraction from the brain to the motor neurons, to the neuromuscular junction, to the release of calcium in there. So you have a stronger, more efficient contraction when your body is in this state of lower inflammation. You reduce the burden of having to digest food. And then you have ketones too that are in the mix. So your body becomes a more efficient machine. So this probably, your strength will probably go up in like pulling exercises, maybe in deadlifts, but probably not things like bench press or, which certain exercises you have the advantage of maybe holding extra weight because you simply have, if you expand the cells, with like creatine and carbs and you're holding extra glycogen, then you essentially have more cellular leverage to move more weight. So for example, my nutrition, fasting regimens are different depending on like what type of workout I'm going into, so that needs to be taken into account.